castle, as befitted its importance. Lewis was blowing hard from the climb. He had a time keeping up. The Kazin did not run, but he walked faster than a man could walk. Lewis reached the landing as Speaker pushed through a double door ahead of him. Through that gap, Lewis saw a horizontal band of jet black, 8 inches broad and 3 feet off the ground. He looked beyond it, looked for a similar strip of baby blue, checked with midnight blue rectangles, and he found it. Jackpot. Lewis stood in the doorway, taking in details. The miniature Ringworld was almost as large as the room, which was circular and perhaps 120 feet across. At the hub of the circular map was a rectangular screen, heavily mounted, facing away from the doorway, but built to turn. High on the walls were 10 turning globes. They varied in size, and they turned at different rates, but each was the characteristic color, rich blue with swirled white frosting, of an Earth-like world. There was a conic section map below each globe. "I spent the night here working," said Speaker. He was standing behind the screen. "I have many things to show you. Come here." Lewis almost ducked under the ring. A thought stopped him. A hawk-featured man who ruled the banquet hall would never have stooped so, not even to enter this holy of holies. Lewis walked at the ring and through it, and found it was a hollow projection. He took up a stance behind the Kazin. Control panels surrounded the screen. All the knobs were large and massive, made of silver, and each was carved to represent the head of some animal. The boards were contoured in swirls and curves. Prettified, Lewis thought. Decadent. The screen was alight but unmagnified. Looking into it was like looking down on the Ringworld from the vicinity of the shadow squares. Lewis felt a touch of déjà vu. "I had it focused earlier," said the Kazin, "if I remember rightly." He touched a knob, and the view expanded so fast that Lewis's hand clutched for a throttle. "I wanted to show you the rim wall, a bit off." He touched another fierce-visaged knob, and the view slid. They were looking over the edge of the Ringworld. Somewhere were telescopes to give them this view. Where? Mounted on the shadow squares. They were looking down on 1,000-mile-high mountains. Still, the view expanded as Speaker found ever finer controls. Lewis marveled at how abruptly the mountains, appearing very natural but for their size, were cut by the knife-edge shadow of space. Then he saw what ran along the peaks of the mountains. Though it was only a line of silver dots, he knew what it would be. A linear accelerator. "Yes," said Speaker. "Without transfer booths, it is the only feasible way to travel Ringworld distances. It must have been the major transport system." "But it's 1,000 miles high. Elevators?" "I found elevator shafts all along the rim wall. There, for instance." By now the silver thread was a line of tiny loops, widely spaced, each hidden from the land below by a mountain peak. A tube, so slender as to be barely visible, led from one of the loops down the slope of a mountain into a layer of clouds at the bottom of the Ringworld atmosphere. Speaker said, "The electromagnetic loops cluster thickly around the elevator shafts. Elsewhere they are up to 1,000,000 miles apart. I surmise that they are not needed except for starting and stopping and guidance. A car could be accelerated to free fall, coast around the rim at a relative 77 miles per second, to be stopped near an elevator tube cluster of loops. It'd take up to 10 days to get a man where he wants to go, no counting accelerations. Trivial. It takes you 60 days to reach Silver Eyes, the human world farthest from Earth. You would need 4 times that long to cross known space from edge to edge. True. And the living area on the Ringworld was greater than that of all known space. They built for room when they built this thing. Lewis asked, "Did you see any sign of activity? Is anyone using the linear accelerator?" "The question is meaningless. Let me show you." The view converged, slid sideways, expanded slowly. It was night. Dark clouds diverged over dark land, and then city lights. Well, Lewis swallowed. It had come too suddenly, so it's not all dead. We can get help. I do not think so. This may be difficult to find. Ah, Finnegan's black mind. The castle, obviously their own castle, floated serenely above a field of light. Windows, neon, streams of floating light motes, which must have been vehicles. Oddly shaped floating buildings. Lovely. Tapes. Tangent were watching old tapes. I thought they must be live transmissions. For one glorious moment it had seemed that their search was over. Lighted, bustling cities pinpointed on a map for them. But these pictures must be ages old. Civilizations old. I thought so also, for many hours last night. I did not suspect the truth until I failed to find the thousands of miles of meteor craters slashed by the Liar's Landing. Lewis, speechless, thwacked the Kazin on his nude pink and lavender shoulder. It was as high as he could reach. The Kazin ignored the liberty. After I had located the castle, things proceeded quickly. Observe. He caused the view to slide rapidly to port. The dark land blurred, lost all detail. Then they were over black ocean. The camera seemed to back up. You see, a bay of one of the major salt oceans falls across our path to the rim wall. The ocean itself is several times as large as any on Kazin or Earth. The bay is as large as our largest ocean. More delay, can't we go over it? Perhaps we can, but we face greater delay than that. The Kazin reached for a knob. Hold it. I want to look closer at those groups of islands. Why, Lewis, that we might stop for provisions? No. Do you see how they tend to form clusters, with wide stretches of deep water between? Take that grouping there. Lewis's forefingers circled images on the screen. Now look up at that map. I do not understand. And that grouping is what you call a bay, and that map behind you. The continents and the conic projections are a little distorted. See it now. 10 worlds, 10 clusters of islands. They aren't 1-to-1 scale, but I'll bet that island is as big as Australia, and the original continent doesn't look any bigger than Eurasia on the globe. What a macabre jest. Lewis, does this represent a typically human sense of humor? No. Sentiment. Unless... Yes. I hadn't thought of that. The first generation, they had to throw away their own worlds, but they wanted to keep something of what they were losing. 3 generations later, it would be funny. It's always that way. When the Kazin was sure Lewis had finished, he asked somewhat diffidently, Do you humans feel that you understand Kazinti? Lewis smiled and shook his head. Good, said the Kazin, and changed the subject. I spent some time last night examining the nearest spaceport. They stood at the hub of miniature Ringworld, looking through a rectangular window into the past. The past they saw was one of magnificent achievement. Speaker had focused the screen on the spaceport, a wide projecting ledge on the spaceward side of the rim wall. They watched as an enormous blunt-ended cylinder, alight with 1,000 windows, was landed in electromagnetic cradling fields. The fields glowed in pastel shades, probably so that the operators could manipulate them visually. "The tape is looped," said Speaker. "I watched it for some time last night. The passengers seemed to walk directly into the rim wall, as if a kind of osmosis process were being used." Yeah, Lewis was badly depressed. The spaceport ledge was far to spinward of them, a distance to dwarf the distance they had already traveled. "I watched a ship take off. They did not use the linear accelerator. They use it only for landings, to match the velocity of the ship to that of the spaceport. For takeoffs, they simply tumble the ship off into space." "It was as the Leaf Eater guessed, Lewis. Remember the trapdoor arrangement. The Ringworld spins easily, fast enough for a ramscoop field to operate. Lewis, are you listening?" Lewis shook himself. "Sorry, all I can think about is that this adds about 700,000 miles to our trip." "It may be possible to use the main transport system, the small linear accelerator at the top of the rim wall." "Not a chance, it's probably wrecked. Civilization tends to spread if there's a transport system to spread it. And even if we can get it working, we aren't moving towards an elevator shaft." "That is true," said the Gazin. "I looked for one." In the rectangular screen, the ship was down. Floating trucks ran a jointed tube to the ship's main lock. Passengers spilled into the tube. "Shall we change our goal?" "We can't. The spaceport is still our best chance." "Is it?" "Yes, tangent. Big as it is, the Ringworld is a colony world. Civilizations always center around the spaceport on a colony world." "Because craft come home from the home world, carrying news of technological innovations. We surmise that the Ringworlders have abandoned their home world." "But the ships can still come in," Lewis said doggedly, "from the abandoned worlds from centuries ago. Ram ships are subject to relativity, to time dilation." "You hope to find old specimen trying to teach the old skills to savages who have forgotten them. And you may be right," said Speaker. "But I weary of this structure, and the spaceport is very far. What else can I show you on the map screen?" Suddenly Lewis asked, "How far have we come since we left the Lyre?" "I told you I could not find our impact crater. Your guess is as accurate as mine, but I know how far we must go. From the castle to the rim is approximately 200,000 miles. "A long way, but you must have found the mountain." "No." "The big one, Fist of God, we crashed practically on its slope." "No." "I don't like that, Speaker. Is there any way we could have gotten off course? You should have found Fist of God just by backtracking starboard from the castle." "But I did not. Do you wish to see anything more? For example, there are blank areas. Probably they are due only to worn tape, but I wonder if they might not conceal places on the Ringworld whose nature is secret." "But we'd have to go there ourselves to find out." Speaker suddenly turned to face the double doors, his ears spread like fans. Silently, he dropped to all fours and leapt. Lewis blinked. What could have caused that? And then he heard it. Considering its age, the castle machinery had been remarkably silent. Now there came a low-pitched hum from outside the double doors. Speaker was out of sight. Lewis drew his flashlight laser and followed cautiously. He found the Kazin at the head of the stairs. He put the weapon away, and together they watched Tila ride up. "They only go up," Tila told them, "not down. The one between the 6th and 7th floors won't go at all." Lewis asked the obvious question. How do you make them move?
You just grip the banister and push forward. That way it won't go unless you're hanging on. Safer. I only found out by accident.
You would. I climbed 10 flights of stairs this morning. How many did you climb before you found out?
None. I was going up for breakfast, and I tripped on the first step and grabbed for the banister.
Right. It figures. Tila looked hurt.
It's not my fault if you...
Sorry. Did you get your breakfast?
No. I've been watching people move around below us. Did you know there's a public square just under the building?
Speaker's ears opened wide. Is there? And it is not deserted?
No, they've been filing in from all directions all morning. By now there must be hundreds of them.
She smiled like dawn breaking.
And they're singing.
There were wide spots along all the corridors of the castle. Each such alcove was furnished with rugs and couches and tables, apparently so that any group of strollers could take a meal wherever he fancied, wherever he might be. In one such dining nook, near the basement level of the castle, was a long window bent at right angles to form half a wall, half a floor. Lewis was panting a little from having descended 10 flights of stairs. He found himself fascinated by the dining table. Its top seemed sculpted, but the contours were shaped and placed to suggest soup plates, salad, or butter, or dinner plates, or coasters for the bottom of a mug. Decades or centuries of use had stained the hard white material. You wouldn't use plates, Lewis speculated. You'd dish the food into the depressions and hose the table off afterward. It seemed unsanitary, but they wouldn't bring flies or mosquitoes or wolves. Why should they bring bacteria? Colonic bacteria, he answered himself, for digestion, and if one bacteria mutated, turned vicious, by then there would be no immunity to anything. Was that how the Ringworld civilization had died? Any civilization requires a minimum number to maintain it. Tila and Speaker were paying him no attention. They knelt in the bend of the window, looking down. Lewis went to join them.
They're still at it,
said Tila. And they were. Lewis guessed that 1,000 people were looking up at him. They were not chanting now. They can't know we're here, he said. Speaker suggested, perhaps they worship the building. Even so, they can't do this every day. We're too far from the edge of town. They couldn't reach the fields. Perhaps we happened by on a special day, the holy day.
Tila said, maybe something happened last night. Something special like us, if someone spotted us after all. Or like that.
She pointed. I wondered about that. Speaker said, how long has it been falling?
Since I woke up, at least. It's like a rain, or a new kind of snow. Wire from the shadow squares, mile after mile of it. Why do you suppose it fell here?
Lewis thought of 6 million miles of distance between each shadow square, of an entire 6 million mile strand torn loose by its impact with the lyre, falling with the lyre toward the Ringworld landscape on nearly the same course. It was hardly surprising that they had come across part of that enormous strand. He was not in a long-winded mood. Coincidence, he said.
Anyway, it's draped all over us, and it's been falling since last night, probably. The natives have been worshipping the castle already, because it floats.
Consider, the Gazin said slowly, if Ringworld engineers were to appear today, floating down from this floating castle, it would be taken as more appropriate than surprising. Lewis, shall we try the God Gambit? Lewis turned to answer, and couldn't. He could only try to keep a straight face. He might have made it, but Speaker was explaining to Tila. It was Lewis's suggestion that we might succeed better with the natives by posing as Ringworld engineers. You and Lewis were to be acolytes. Nessus was to be a captive demon, but we can hope to do without him. I was to be more god than engineer, a kind of war god. Then Tila started to laugh, and Lewis broke up. 8 feet tall, inhumanly broad across the shoulders and hips, the Kazin was too big and too toothy to be other than fearsome, even when burnt bald. His rat-like tail had always been his least impressive feature. Now his skin was the same color, baby pink, crisscrossed with lavender capillaries. Without the fur to bulk out his head, his ears became ungainly pink parasols. Orange fur made a domino mask across his eyes, and he seemed to have grown his own fluffy orange pillow to sit on. The danger of laughing at a Kazin only made it funnier. Doubled over with his arms around his middle, laughing silently now because he could not inhale, Lewis backed towards what he hoped was a chair. An inhumanly large hand closed on his shoulder and lifted him high. Still convulsed with mirth, Lewis faced the Kazin at eye level. He heard, "Truly, Lewis, you must explain this behavior." Lewis made an enormous effort. "A kind of war god," he said, and was off again. Tila was making hiccuping sounds. The Kazin set him down and waited for the fit to pass. "You simply aren't impressive enough to play God," Lewis said some minutes later. "Not until the hair grows back." "But if I tore some humans to pieces with my hands, perhaps they would respect me then." "They'd respect you from a distance and from hiding. That wouldn't do us any good. No, we'll just have to wait for the hair. Even then, we ought to have Nessus's task." "The puppeteer is unavailable." "But I say he is unavailable. How shall we contact the natives?" "You'll have to stay here. See what you can learn from the map room." "Tila and I," said Lewis, and suddenly remembered. "Tila, you haven't seen the map room." "What's it like?" "You stay here and get Speaker to show you. I'll go down alone. You two can monitor me by communicator disc, and come for me if there's trouble. Speaker, I want your flashlight laser." The Kazin grumbled, but he did relinquish the flashlight laser. It still left him with the modified slaver disintegrator. From 1,000 feet over their heads he heard their reverent silence become a murmur of astonishment, and he knew that they had seen him, a bright speck separating from the castle window. He sank towards them. The murmur did not die. It was suppressed. He could hear the difference. Then the singing began. "It drags," Tila had said, and "they don't keep in step," and "it all sounds flat." Lewis's imagination had gone on from there. As a result, the singing took him by surprise. It was much better than he had expected. He guessed that they were singing a 12-tone scale. The octave scale of most of the human worlds was also a 12-tone scale, but with differences. Small wonder it had sounded flat to Tila. Yes, it dragged. It was church music, slow and solemn and repetitive, without harmony, but it had grandeur. The square was immense. 1,000 people were a vast throng after the weeks of loneliness, but the square could have held 10 times that number. Loudspeakers could have kept them singing in step, but there were no loudspeakers. A lone man waved his arms from a pedestal in the center of the square, but they would not look at him. They were all looking up at Lewis Wu. For all that, the music was beautiful. Tila could not hear that beauty. The music of her experience had come from recordings and tri-D sets, always by way of a microphone system. Some music could be amplified, rectified, the voices multiplied or augmented, the bad takes thrown away. Tila Brown had never heard live music. Louis Wu had. He slowed his cycle to give his nerve ends time to adapt to the rhythms of it. He remembered the great public sings on the cliffs above Crash Landing City. Throngs which had boasted twice this number, sings which had sounded different for that, and another reason. For Louis Wu had been singing too. Now as he let the music vibrate in him, his ears began to adjust to the slightly sharp or flat notes, to the blurring of voices, to the repetition, to the slow majesty of the hymn. He caught himself as he was about to join in the singing. That's not a good idea, he thought, and let his cycle settle toward the square. The pedestal in the center of the square had once held a statue. Louis identified the human-like footprints, each 4 feet long, that marked where the statue had stood. Now the pedestal housed a kind of triangular altar, and a man stood with his back to the altar, waving his arms as the people sang. Flash of pink above gray robe. Louis assumed that the man was wearing a headpiece, perhaps of pink silk. He chose to land on the pedestal itself. He was just touching down when the conductor turned to face him. As a result, he almost wrecked the cycle. It was Pink Scalp Louis had seen, unique in this crowd of heads like golden flowers, faces of blonde hair with eyes peeping through. This man's face was as naked as Louis Wu's own. With a straight-armed gesture, palms down, the man held the last note of the singing, held it for seconds, then cut it. A fragment of a second later, the tail of it drifted in from the edges of the square. The priest faced Louis Wu in a sudden silence. He was as tall as Louis Wu, tall for a native. The skin of his face and scalp were so pale as to be nearly translucent, like a we-mated albino. He must have shaved many hours ago with a razor that was not sharp enough, and now the stubble was emerging, adding its touch of gray everywhere but for the 2 circles around his eyes. He spoke with a note of reproof, or so it seemed. The translator disc instantly said, "So you have come at last." "We didn't know we were expected," Louis Wu said truthfully. He was not confident enough to try a god gambit based on himself. In a long lifetime he had learned that telling a consistent set of lies could get hellishly complicated. "You grow hair on your head," said the priest. "One presumes that your blood is less than pure, O engineer." So that was it. The race of the engineers must have been totally bald, so that this priest must imitate them by using a blunt razor on his tender skin. Or had the engineers used D-pill cream or something just as easy, for no reason than pressing fashion? The priest looked very like the wire portrait in the banquet hall. "My blood is of no concern to you," Louis said, shelving the problem. "We are on our way to the rim of the world. What can you tell us about our route?" The priest was transparently puzzled. "You ask information from me, you, an engineer." "I'm not an engineer." Louis held his hand ready to activate the sonic field. But the priest only looked more bewildered. "Then why are you half hairless? How do you fly? Have you stolen secrets from heaven? What do you want here? Have you come to steal my congregation?" The last question seemed the important one. "We're on our way to the rim. All we need here is information." "Surely your answers are in heaven." "Don't be flippant with me," Louis said evenly. "But you came directly from heaven. I saw you." "Oh, the castle. We've gone through the castle, but it didn't tell us much. For instance, were the engineers really hairless?" "I have sometimes thought that they only shaved, as I do. Yet your own chin seems naturally hairless." "I depilate." Louis looked about him, at the sea of reverent golden flower faces. What do they believe? They don't seem to share your doubts. They see us talking as equals in the language of the engineers. I would have this continue if it please you. Now the priest's manner seemed conspiratorial rather than hostile. Would that improve your standing with them? I suppose it would, said Lewis. The priest really had feared to lose his congregation, as any priest might if his god came to life and tried to take over. Can't they understand us? Perhaps 1 word in 10. At this point, Lewis had cause to regret the efficiency of his translator disc. He could not tell if the priest was speaking the language of Signamu-Click-Click. Knowing how far the two languages had diverged since the breakdown in communications, he might have been able to date the fall of civilization. What was this castle called Heaven? He asked. Do you know? The legends speak of Zriller, said the priest, and of how he ruled all the lands under heaven. On this pedestal stood Zriller's statue, which was life-sized. The lands supplied heaven with delicacies which I could name if you like, as we learn their names by rote, but in these days they do not grow. Shall I? No thanks. What happened? A sing-song quality had crept into the man's voice. He must have heard this tale many times, and told it many times. Heaven was made when the engineers made the world and the arch. He who rules heaven rules the land from edge to edge. So Zriller ruled for many lifetimes, throwing sunfire from heaven when he was displeased. Then it was suspected that Zriller could no longer throw sunfire. The people no longer obeyed him. They did not send food. They pulled down the statue. When Zriller's angels dropped rocks from the heights, the people dodged and laughed. There came a day when the people tried to take heaven by way of the rising stairway, but Zriller caused the stairway to fall. Then his angels left heaven in flying cars. Later it was regretted that we had lost Zriller. The sky was always overcast. Crops grew stunted. We have prayed for Zriller's return. How accurate is all of this, do you think? I would have denied it all until this morning, when you came flying down from heaven. You make me terribly uneasy, O engineer. Perhaps Zriller does indeed intend to return, and sends his bastard ahead to clear the way of false priests. I could shave my scalp with that help. No, never mind. Ask your questions. What can you tell me about the fall of Ringworld civilization? The priest looked still more uneasy. Is civilization about to fall? Lewis sighed and, for the first time, turned to consider the altar. The altar occupied the center of the pedestal on which they stood. It was of dark wood. Its flat, rectangular surface had been carved into a relief map, with hills and rivers and a single lake, and 2 upward-turning edges. The other pair of edges, the short edges, were the bases of a golden paraboloid arch. The gold of that arch was tarnished, but from the curve of its apex a small golden ball hung by a thread, and that gold was highly polished. Is civilization in danger? So much has happened. The sunwire, your own coming. Is it sunwire? Is the sun falling on us? I strongly doubt it. You mean the wire that's been falling all morning? Yes, in our religious training we were taught that the sun hangs from the arch by a very strong thread. This thread is strong, we know, said the priest. A girl tried to pick it up and undo a tangle, and it cut through her fingers. Lewis nodded. Nothing's falling, he said. Privately, he thought. Not even the shadow squares. Even if you cut all the wires, the squares wouldn't hit the Ringworld. The engineers would have given them an orbital aphelion inside the ring. He asked, without much hope, "What do you know about the transport system at the rim?" And in that instant, he knew something was wrong. He'd caught something, some evidence of disaster, but what? The priest said, "Would you mind repeating that?" Lewis did. The priest answered, "Your thing that talks said something else the first time. Something about a restricted... something." "Funny," said Lewis, and this time he heard it. The translator spoke in a different tone of voice, and it spoke at length. "You are using a restricted wavelength in violation. I do not remember the rest," said the priest. "We had best end this interview. You have reawakened something ancient, something evil." The priest stopped to listen, for Lewis's translator was speaking again in the priest's language, in violation of Edict 12, interfering with maintenance. "Can your powers hold back?" Whatever else the priest said was not translated. For the disc suddenly turned red-hot in Lewis's hand. He instantly threw it as hard as he could. It was white-hot and brightly glowing when it hit the pavement, without hurting anyone as far as he could see. Then the pain backlashed him, and he was half-blinded by tears. He was able to see the priest nod to him, very formal and regal. He looked back, his face equally expressionless. He had never dismounted his cycle. Now he touched the control and rose toward heaven. When his face could not be seen, he let it snarl with the pain, and he used a word he had heard once on Wonderland, from a man who had dropped a piece of stupid crystal 1,000 years old.